مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. قبل وقت طويل أرسلوا التقارير مع القوافل أو السفن المبهرة، واستغرق الأمر شهورا في بعض الأحيان لتصل إلى وجهتها. ثم غير التلغراف كل شيء وأعطى الفرصة لنقل الأحداث فور وقوعها. ثم تحسنت التكنولوجيا تحسنا سريعا من خلال آلات البرق وآلات الفاكس وأجهزة راديو القمر الصناعي كبيرة الحجم، وأخيرا الهواتف الذكية والسكايب. بالنسبة لمراسل أجنبي تغيرت سبل نقل المعلومات والأفكار، ولكن الوظيفة نفسها لم تشهد تغيرا كبيرا، فهي تتلخص في شرح الأحداث والتوجهات والثقافات من أنحاء العالم إلى القراء في الوطن. وبالنسبة لمراسل أجنبي لصحيفة واشنطن بوست، الصحيفة الرائدة في عاصمة بلدنا، يشمل القراءة رئيس الولايات المتحدة. لما يقرب من 40 عاما فسر ضيفنا الأحداث والتوجهات والثقافات في الشرق الأوسط وأفريقيا للقراءة في واشنطن، ولفهم الدور الحيوي الذي يمكن أن يلعبه مراسل أجنبي في سير السياسة الخارجية. يسرني أن أرحب بالصحفي المرموق الحائز على الجوائز ديفيد أوتاواي. Welcome back to Dakhel Washington. Today, our special guest is David Ottaway, famed international correspondent with more than 30 years' experience covering the world and especially the Middle East. David, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure.
David, so much has happened in your career in terms of change in the Middle East that I'm going to ask you an unfair question, which is to give us the fortune cookie version of the basic evolution. What's the biggest change that you have seen in your experience in the Middle East?
Well, I was there when Anwar Sadat was assassinated, in the stands with him. That was a huge change in the Middle East. I'd say since then the Arab Spring is by far the biggest shakeup to the old order that I have seen in my lifetime covering or being in the Middle East.
And there's a debate in many parts of Washington that revolves around the question, why is the Middle East at least seem so impervious to the democratic revolution that has occurred in the last generation, whether it's in Asia or Eastern Europe or Latin America? Why not in this part of the world?
It's an excellent question. I think the authoritarian traditions in Arab society is part of the problem. I mean, you know, Egypt was ruled by pharaohs for thousands of years. The state is just a huge block, and the rule of the pharaoh, there's a very long tradition in Egypt, and that's one reason. You have to some extent take it country by country. You know, you still have 8 monarchies in the Arab world, 6 in the Gulf and Morocco and Jordan, and they are not democratic systems, and many of them have been there for, you know, hundreds of years. So you have that tradition. And then you have, I guess what you'd call it, the leftist ideologies that promoted, you know, Arab socialism, Arab nationalism. And they were, you know, they were vanguard party systems. And they're authoritarian too. So there are, to me, there are a lot of issues involved in explaining why democracy has had such a hard time in emerging in the Arab world.
And I mean, you've been to and covered other parts of the world that also had these obstacles. Is there a secret recipe that is missing in this part of the world?
just so many traditions that seem to reinforce each other, and then you have to say, you have to take the Arab world area by area. Levant, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, they're a mosaic of peoples, and both religious and ethnic, and that produces certain problems in how you rule those types of society. And they are artificial countries to begin with, created by the French and the British. So they're still having trouble with identity issues, and it's been made worse by the Arab Spring. And so there are so many issues sort of mixed together to explain why the Arab world is the way it is, yesterday and today.
And so for all these years reporting from this part of the world, how would you evaluate the extent to which U.S. government officials, in your view, understood these dynamics?
There are, in the State Department, there are plenty of experts who spend their lives studying the various parts of the world. But the political process and the change of presidencies has often produced, different efforts or different emphasis of what that administration tried to do or had to deal with. So you get a great deal of change in Washington in its viewpoint towards this part of the world that we're talking about, the Middle East. And because there are so many interests there that come back to the United States, whether it's economic interest or the fate of Israel, there are so many different interests. Washington is always got a focus on the Middle East.
So when you look at the Middle East today, what do you think is the brightest spot? Some good news?
Well, I think there are several. Tunisia, certainly, that's the only Arab country that came out of the Arab Spring, as we call it, the uprisings of 2011, with some form of democracy. Maybe too much democracy, but it's certainly different from the system that was there before. And then I think Morocco has been successful in dealing with the challenge of Islamists coming to power or demanding a bigger role in government. The king has been very wily and wise about how he dealt with the challenge of Arab Spring. And you still have a prime minister in Morocco who comes from the Islamic Party. And so that's been a big change. And there's a kind of understanding between the Islamic Party and the king about how they're going to try and cooperate. That's to me is progress. I think other than those two countries, it's hard to see a lot of progress.
So if you take oil out of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, do you think there's a strategic future for this partnership?
Oh, yeah.
You do?
Because I think the Islamic extremist threat is here to stay for many years yet in various forms, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. Now, you wrote a book about one particular Saudi diplomat who had unique role in Washington policymaking, Prince Bandar bin Sultan. Is that era where a single Arab diplomat can have such access and such influence, has that passed?
Well, in the case of Saudi Arabia, it has for some years. I don't know whether the new ambassador, who's the younger brother of the crown prince, maybe he's going to have that kind of influence. But we have Arab characters, let's call them, like Otabi, the ambassador from the United Arab Emirates. He has been very active, and he's learned. There are very few Arab diplomats that enjoy and learn to play the Washington political game.
How would you define that?
You have to get to know people in various institutions, Congress, Pentagon, the White House, CIA, FBI. Washington is very complicated, and there are competing agencies and departments about what U.S. policy ought to be. So an ambassador has to get to know a lot of different players, from particularly Congress, which is extremely complicated in and of itself, with all kinds of different interest groups, even vying, opposing each other. So it's a very difficult place to work for a foreign diplomat, and particularly if your country is as important as, say, Saudi Arabia or United Arab Emirates is to Washington right now. And Bandar, the only character that I see on the scene today that's anywhere similar to Bandar is Otabi, who seems to know how to swim in the waters of Washington and play the game, and we know quite a bit about him because of all WikiLeaks and everything that's coming out about his activities here. So he kind of reminds me of the Bandar that I knew 20 years ago.
And generally, in your experience, do Arab diplomats are successful at projecting their role in Washington and getting their voice heard and having the access and influence to be influential?
Well, one of the things that's changed in the last few years is the increased activity of a number of Arab countries in the, let's call it the war of the think tanks in Washington. They've set up their own think tanks. They're getting their voice out, and we're even competing with each other, Qatar versus Saudi Arabia versus, So only in the last few years have I seen some of the Arab governments catch on to how you play the game of Washington politics, to the point that now there are just, there are 4 or 5 different Arab government-supported think tanks in Washington that didn't exist. Everybody used the Arabs and the American journalists used to complain about the lack of any Arab voices. Because we also have to go and find somebody to quote and talk to and get the and there was nobody there for other than Bandar for a long time. And now there are many Arabs or there are think tanks representing their position that are available to journalists, and so you have almost a cacophony of voices, Arab voices, compared to 20 years ago, where there were no voices at all. There was no noise at all on that side of the aisle, if you will, vis-a-vis Israel or vis-a-vis any issues in the Middle East.
Okay, when we come back, we'll talk with David Ottaway about the evolution of covering the Middle East and the relationship that has had on how America has understood the complexities of this part of the world in just a moment. Our guest again today is David Ottaway. David is an institution, one of the great foreign correspondents who immerses himself in a region and knows it at least as well, perhaps better, than any academic scholar or government analyst. He worked for 35 years for the Washington Post as foreign correspondent in the Middle East, in Africa, and Southern Europe, and later as a national security and investigative reporter in Washington, before retiring a decade ago. Since then, David has twice been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. He has won numerous awards for his reporting at home and abroad and was twice nominated for the Pulitzer Prize. He received his bachelor's degree from Harvard and his doctorate from Columbia University in New York. So David, in your experience, who is the most impressive U.S. government official you ever dealt with in terms of their ability to navigate, understand, and implement American policy?
Boy, that's a difficult question. Maybe, well, the one I knew the best was Shultz because I traveled with him.
Secretary of State George Shultz.
Secretary Shultz, who was the Secretary of State under Reagan. I traveled with him, but I would think Baker, Secretary of State Baker, was quite impressive.
What made both of them impressive as compared to others in that position?
you know, you had a feeling that both of them had an impact on the White House. It's important to have a Secretary of State that has some kind of personal relationship with the president if he's going to have any influence in this chaotic process of making foreign policy in Washington. Schultz had the respect and the access to Reagan, and he was very steady, and he was much appreciated in the White House. Baker was just very effective. I mean, he put together the Madrid conference after the Gulf War of 91, and actually got the Israelis and the Saudis in the same room. I mean, you know, he was quite an impressive, very effective, I thought, in using U.S. influence and his own influence to try and get something done in a very difficult part of the world.
So you've identified two secretaries of state that, shall I say, are from a previous generation.
Indeed.
When you look at foreign policy, this administration, the last administration, you're not jumping out with candidates.
No, I'm not. I don't have any feeling of that I was, you know, a great Secretary of State. I mean, Obama made foreign policy. Everybody else was, you know, he thought he knew, whether we agree or not, he thought he knew what he wanted to do in foreign policy and where he wanted to go. And so everybody played supporting roles, and even Hillary Clinton, I don't think was making foreign policy or influencing Obama that much, because Obama was a very strong personality and he had strong ideas in what he wanted to try to do. So I'm Secretary of State Tillerson, maybe it's too early to say, but you certainly don't get the feeling that he's a heavyweight in the White House. Now maybe there's surprises yet to come, but so far I would say we don't see him, we don't feel his influence in the White House in shaping U.S. policy. Not yet, anyway.
Let me ask about your own experience. As I mentioned in the bio, you have a doctorate.
Yes.
You are a real expert. When you look at journalism today, do you see the same level of expertise among people going out doing the work of a foreign correspondent?
Yes and no. I mean, one of the problems is that there are far fewer professional foreign correspondents because the American media and newspapers and television, they don't have the money anymore to keep bureaus open around the world the way as many as there were back in my time as a foreign correspondent. So what you get is, in place of having bureaus in the regions, you get more and more somebody being sent out from Washington or London to cover the story that's breaking in some part of the world, but the correspondent's not living there. So this is unfortunate, and I think I'm not claiming that, you know, you can be a good foreign correspondent if you know the techniques of how to operate in countries where you really you're not familiar with. Because you learn as a foreign correspondent to whom to go to get a variety of views on what's going on in that country. And in my years, when there were many countries in Africa, the first time I went, it was almost kind of a formula of, you know, which embassies. You'd always talk to the local journalist to find out who they thought was a smart diplomat. Talk to not just the American embassy, but if it was a French colony, you went and talked to the French. If it was a British colony, you went and talked to the British embassy. But sometimes the person that was the most informed was, I mean, I remember going to Iraq, and India had an excellent diplomat, and this would have been in the 80s. And they knew a lot about what was going on. So, but you first, I've always found local journalists very helpful. And to find out who is the smartest, you know, observers, in addition to themselves, by the way. So you figure out how to operate. So I guess my point is you don't have to have a PhD in the Middle East to know how to become a good foreign correspondent. It helps to have the history and to know the tensions of the region, or what these countries have gone through. But you can also learn that pretty quickly if you're a good foreign correspondent. Now, I'll be the first to say that there are a lot of not so good foreign correspondents. They're just kind of adventurers that want to go out and get involved in watching a war unfold, but I think the basic problem is we don't have as many bureaus by either the television companies or the print companies around the world anymore. And that makes it much more difficult to get any kind of expertise from daily foreign correspondents, or correspondents that are reporters that are sent out to pretend they're foreign correspondents when they're sent out, on 24 hours notice to go and cover what's happening. And sometimes even in Paris now, I heard that some of the TV companies they send people ahead of time to line up interviews so that when they arrive, they can interview 5 or 6 people and go back home the next day. I mean, we've come a long way in the wrong way in some instances in how foreign correspondents have to work or do work.
Are there any advantages to the current situation, whether it's technological or human personnel? Are there any benefits of where we are now?
Yeah, when I started in the Middle East, this is how you sent your articles. You went to the post office and you cut a tape, and then the tape ran through a machine that sent your tape, or what was on the tape, back to your home office. It would take hours to do this in many cases, because you had to go to the post office. Sometimes you had to stand in line. Then you had to cut your tape, because they wouldn't. You'd rather do it yourself than have them do it, because you didn't know whether they could do it. So just the physical effort of sending your story back in the days when I began was something. Now, I was just at the hinge when things started to get better, when we started to be able to send it by telephone. And we called them the Radio Shack 80s or something. And there you had couplers, and you put it on telephone, and you could send it by telephone. That was a big breakthrough. Now today, everybody can, you have it's really simple to send your story by telephone. You have your iPad or iPhone or international telephones, and it's become much easier. So just the process of producing a story and sending it has become far, far easier than when I started out in the early ages.
Well, very good. David, thank you. This has been fascinating. Thank you for giving us this look inside your career and what's going on in the Middle East today.
Been my pleasure. Thank you.
بهذا نصل إلى نهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول تطور العلاقة بين أمريكا والمملكة العربية السعودية، أرجو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على عنوان البريد الإلكتروني التالي insidewashington@elhura.com. معكم روبرت ساتلوف. شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.